In this video lesson, what we want to address is the humanity and divinity of Christ, and really how these two natures go together. And so you have an image on your screen here of an Eastern Orthodox group of icons that one expresses Christ's divinity, one expresses his humanity, and then the one that's on the left there is really this combination of the two. And so what we want to address is questions related to, did Jesus have omniscience as a baby? Did God die on the cross? Or if God is omnipresent and Jesus can only be in one place at a time, then doesn't that mean that Jesus can't be God? Or if God can't be tempted and Jesus is God, then Jesus wasn't truly tempted, or was he not really human? Those are the kinds of questions that come when we start asking and trying to think through how is the relationship of Christ and his humanity parallel to or connected to his divinity. And so I want to address this by, first of all, talking about a key term here, the big word of hypostatic union. And I know that sounds impressive and really theological and everything, but I want to connect this back to conversation about the Trinity, and one of these key words that we say God exists as one being in three persons. The word for person in the Greek is hypostasis. That's what has been handed down to us from the early church fathers to today, that there are three hypostases. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are each a hypostasis. And so when Jesus becomes human and is the Word who dwells among us, he does not add another hypostasis. He doesn't become another person. It's not as if there's a human person and a divine person. That, in fact, is an actual heresy. Instead, when the Son takes on flesh, he is still only one hypostasis, only one person. But now, in the incarnation, this hypostasis has two natures, or we could use the word essences. Two natures or essences united in his person. And so that's the hypostatic union. There's a union or a uniting of a divine nature and a human nature in one person. And to use the words from the Chalcedonian formula, these natures are not mixed or blended, divided or separated, because if they were, those lead into other problems which have actually been identified as different heresies. So I want to provide you with this language of the hypostatic union, that Christ is one person with two natures, who eternally exists in his divine nature and took on a human nature. So his divine nature has the attributes of God, that what is true of God is true of him in his divinity. The words that you see here are from the Athanasian Creed that reinforces this. The Athanasian Creed in this section reads that we believe and confess that our Lord Jesus Christ, God's Son, is both God and human equally. He is God from the essence of the Father, begotten before time, describing that Father-Son relationship from all eternity. And he is human from the essence of his mother, born in time, completely God, completely human, with a rational soul and human flesh, equal to the Father as regards divinity, less than the Father as regards humanity. And those last phrases, again, are also ones that rule out certain heresies that did not portray Christ as either fully divine or fully human. Both have to be held together. And so that leads us to these questions of, well, how are both of these true of the same person, Christ? And so the language that gets provided for us is what's called the communication of attributes, or sometimes the communication of properties. If you want the Latin, it's the communicatio idiomatum. And so I want to again give you the language for this that I want to apply then to the questions that we're raising here. So this is what the communication of attributes, at least from the Reformed perspective. Actually, historically, there's different perspectives in the Lutheran tradition as they debated about the Lord's Supper and other kinds of things. This is what I would say is the best understanding, the most faithful understanding of the communication of attributes. What can be said about an attribute of one nature of Christ can be said about the person of Christ, but not necessarily the other nature. So the two natures united in one person, the hypostasis, hypostatic union, what can be said about an attribute of one nature, whether that's his human nature or his divine nature, can be said about him as a person. It is true of him because of the hypostatic union. But that's not necessarily true of the other nature. This takes us back to the communicable and incommunicable attributes of God. That there are certain attributes of God that are communicable and that he can share them with humans and does share them with us because we are created in the image of God. There are other attributes of God that are incommunicable, that cannot be shared. They are attributes that are only true of God, only true of divinity. Things like his omnipresence. He is present everywhere, and that is not an attribute that can be shared with humans. We are limited in our presence. Things like even his omniscience, that he knows everything there is to know, or his eternality, that he has always existed and will never cease to exist. That is not a communicable attribute. We, as humans, have a beginning. And so there is the attributes that can be shared with humans are these communicable attributes. And so when we talk about Christ in his two natures, there are certain attributes that will be true of both his human nature and his divine nature. That he's personal, that he's relational, those kind of things, that he's faithful. Those are attributes that are true of both his divine nature and his human nature because they are communicable attributes. The ones that raise the question are when they are addressing incommunicable attributes that are true of God, that are true of the divine nature, that aren't shared with his human nature. Yet as Christ is both fully God and fully human, he has those attributes in his person. So let's address a couple of examples here. The first one that I'll address is, did God die on the cross? This is both a Christological and a Trinitarian question. Well, in some ways we'd have to say, no, God can't die. It's an attribute of God that he is eternal and self-existent, and nothing outside of himself can make him not exist or can kill him. So it seems like, well, the answer would be no, God didn't die on the cross. Well, but then the response would be, well, if God didn't die on the cross and Jesus died on the cross, then doesn't that mean Jesus is not God? This is where the communication of attributes becomes helpful to answer that question in a non-heretical way. Since Christ's human nature died, and he died physically, and his soul went to where the realm of the dead, where souls go, he died, he really truly died. His human nature died because humanity can die, has the attribute of being able to die. Christ the person died. Therefore, God died. Now, God the Father didn't die. God the Spirit didn't die. God the Son died. The second person of the Trinity truly died in his humanity. Therefore, God died. The whole Trinity didn't die, but God the Son died. And so Christ's divine nature, while it cannot die, Christ the person can die and did die because he also has a human nature. And we actually see language like this from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 2. He makes this statement that they crucified the Lord of glory. Well, we know that the Lord of glory is a reference to God. And so the crucifying the Lord of glory, he's saying they killed God. They killed God the Son in particular. Now the second one, was Jesus omniscient as a baby? Or doesn't Jesus have limited knowledge? How can he be both omniscient and limited knowledge? And I'll just give a couple of biblical examples, scriptural examples from the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew in particular, that in Matthew 24:36, Jesus says that not even the Son knows the hour of his return. So he's got limited knowledge. Yet also in Matthew 12:25, we see that it says Jesus knows their thoughts. There are many times where we see Jesus knowing things that cannot be known by just a regular human person. Now, maybe that's a prophetic gift and the Spirit has communicated those things to him. But in many of these contexts, when he says these things and shows and reveals that he knows things that can't be known, people draw the conclusion, especially the Jewish religious leaders, that he's speaking and behaving as if he thinks he's equal to God. And so there is definitely both that are presented in the Gospels, that Jesus has the ability to know things that cannot be known, and yet also is limited in what he knows. And when we go back to this question of, well, was he omniscient as a baby? As his brain is developing, as he is growing, his brain can't even process everything there is to know. And so there's got to be a limitation on what he knows and what he can know, even while he never ceases being God. So he continues to be God and is fully God even as he's conceived and born as a baby. And so he has the divine attributes of God. And so to apply our communication of attributes, we can put it this way. Since Christ's divine nature has infinite knowledge or omniscience, Christ the person does too, even as he's a little baby. But in his human nature, he has humbly chosen to not access that knowledge, or as he's a baby and developing, not even be able to access that knowledge. So in his human nature, he is limited because of what he chose to do in, to use the language of Philippians 2, humbling himself and taking on the form, the appearance of a human and being made in human likeness. He has limited himself without losing his divinity or the divine attributes. And so maybe the next example can also help explain how these two things can go together. And that's often referred to as the impeccability of Christ. And it raises the question of whether or not Jesus actually could sin, or whether or not it wasn't even possible for him to sin because he's fully divine. And so this one raises the question, well, if God can't be tempted and Jesus was tempted, then doesn't that mean Jesus wasn't God? If we apply the communication of attributes, then we can say that since Christ's human nature can be tempted, Christ the person can truly be tempted, even though his divine nature cannot be tempted. So in his humanity, those temptations are very real. And this one I think is a helpful way to see what Jesus has actually done in coming to us as the eternal, fully God, fully divine, absolutely powerful, wonderful, majestic person into a little baby who's going to face suffering and temptation. The incarnation is an amazing and infinite miracle. So Christ is choosing not to take advantage of his divine nature. I use that language because that's the way the NIV has helpfully translated Philippians 2, that Christ, though in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or clung to, or the way the NIV now translates it, taken advantage of. And so what Christ is doing is humbly choosing that he will become incarnate, he will become human, and not giving up his divinity. He is not clinging to or taking advantage of the things that could make it easier for him in his divinity, with his divine nature. And so in many ways, Christ actually had greater temptation, faced greater temptation and suffering by resisting all of the temptations that the devil threw at him in the wilderness, that he would face along the way as he goes to Jerusalem, as he faces the cross, because he could have, theoretically, though he chose not to, access his divine attributes that he cannot be tempted, and then those temptations would be meaningless. But then he would not have that full humanity that he faced every temptation that all of us have faced, yet was without sin, so that, as the Hebrews 4:15 passage reminds us, he is able to empathize with us. He knows what it's like. What can be said about an attribute of one nature of Christ can be said about the person of Christ. They're united together, but not necessarily the other nature. So those communicable attributes of divine nature can also be true of the human nature. But there are incommunicable attributes of Christ's divine nature that are still true of him as a person, that he is omniscient, that he is omnipresent, that he has the ability to do those things, but at the same time, by taking on humanity and those natures being united in his person, he is spatially limited, that he is still fully human for all eternity, and that he chose to do that in the incarnation from before the creation of the world. He chose that that would be the plan so that you and I can be redeemed. So is Jesus omniscient as a baby? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is a bit more complicated. And so again, I encourage you to post your questions, and we will have some time to engage with those questions and interact with how can we grasp that Christ is both completely human and completely God, and those two things be coexisting in one person. Blessings, and may the grace of God be with you all.